If you missed last week, I'm going to show you how to get yourself caught up. So first thing you'll need are 2 pieces of felt in one color for the body, a third piece of felt in a second color for the face, horns, and claws, and then a small piece of this kind of cream colored cloth for the teeth, and a Sharpie. So first thing we'll do is lay the body template on the felt so it's not hanging off any of the edges, and then just very carefully and quickly trace around it with the Sharpie. And don't worry about the Sharpie showing on the felt because this side with the Sharpie on it will go inside and we won't see it. So I'm going to trace it 2 times. If your template goes right up to the edge of your felt, you can kind of skip those spots so you don't draw on the table. Okay, and then when you trace the oval on your third piece of felt, trace it right on the edge. That way you have plenty of space to cut your other pieces. Okay, next I'm going to cut out all 3 of these pieces. And you can actually kind of cut on the outside of the Sharpie line just to make sure that your Yeti's not too small. It is really important that you trace the template on both pieces without moving it so that they match. And if you have any stickers on your felt, you can take those off, but please make sure that you put them in the trash. Do not stick them on the table because they make a big mess. We are going to keep all of the scraps we cut, so don't throw anything away. You'll have a bag, a Ziploc bag to put everything in, so we're just going to keep it in there until we're ready to get rid of our scraps. So I'm going to just keep those all in a pile here. And then my last piece, my oval. Once you get this oval cut out, you're going to want to bring it up for some hot glue. And we'll hot glue the oval to one side of the body and hot glue the eyes on. So bring these 2 pieces up for hot glue. All right, once you have the face and the eyes hot glued on, you're going to need needle and thread. So see your teacher for a needle. And then when you take your thread off, you want to do about an arm's length. So put this piece next to your shoulder and kind of stretch it out to the tip of your fingers. And that's about how much thread you want to start with. Too much will be really difficult to work with, and too little, you won't be able to stitch your whole mouth. So to thread your needle, you want to hold your thread as close to the end as you can. There are individual threads in embroidery floss, so it also does help if you lick it or wet it to help them stick together, and then just push the ends through the eye of the needle and then pull it. Now, when you pull the end through, you do not want to tie it onto the needle. You want to have a short side that's kind of hanging a little tail. If you leave it too short, it will slip out of your needle, so you want to keep it 3 or 4 inches long, and then you should have a longer side. And at the end of this longer side is where you want to tie your knot. So I'm just going to loop my thread around, make a little loop at the end like I would if I was going to tie my shoes, and then pull the end of the embroidery floss through that loop to make a knot. And now that I have a knot, I'm ready to stitch. Now, before I stitch this, I'm going to go ahead and get my teeth ready, because as we stitch the mouth, we're going to stitch on the 2 teeth. You can cut your teeth into any shape. I'm going to cut 2 triangles, and I'm not going to make them too big, but also the smaller they are, the harder they are to stitch on. So I would make them at least as big as a fingertip. All right, so now I've got my threaded needle here with my knot at the end. And when I start sewing the mouth, I'm going to do something called a back stitch, which means I'm going to kind of stitch backwards. I'm going to be stitching from left to right, but each stitch is going to go from the right side to the left side. So I want to start by poking my needle from the back to the front, and I can poke until I see exactly where I want to start, somewhere under my eyes here, not quite all the way to the edge. And then once I get it in the right spot, I'm going to pull my needle all the way until that knot catches on the back. I want to make sure I pull it all the way. I don't want to keep pulling because then I'll just pull my thread right out of my needle. So you can either hold your needle here on the eye to keep your thread from coming out, or just watch it. Now when I put my first stitch in, I'm going to push my needle from front to back now, but I want to go to the left of where I started here. So I'm going to leave a little gap here to the left, and I'm going to pull my needle through the back all the way, and that's going to make a single stitch. Now the reason it's called a back stitch is because I'm kind of stitching from front to back here, the opposite of the way that I'm actually making the line. So now when I bring my needle back up through the back to forward, I'm going to leave a gap between the stitch and where I bring my needle up. So I'm going to pull my needle from back to front. And then when I go back through from front to back, I'm going to connect my stitches. So I'm pushing that needle into the very spot where my last stitch ended. So now I have a continuous line. Now after I've done 2 stitches like that, that's when I want to place my tooth where I want it to go, right there. And so the next stitch I put in, I'm going to do it exactly the same way, but the next stitch I put in is also going to stitch the tooth on. So I'm going to hold the tooth in place, and I'm going to bring my needle up on this bottom right corner of my tooth. So I'm coming from back to front, and then when I go front to back, I'm going to push my needle down through the other bottom left corner of the tooth, and that's going to stitch the tooth on. And I still have my continuous line going here. So now I'm going to leave a gap again, bring my needle forward, and then push it back through, connecting it to my last stitch. Now that I've got a stitch after my tooth, I can add my other tooth. So I'm going to again come back to front on the bottom right corner of the tooth, pull it forward, and then when I go back, I'm going to push it into the bottom left corner of the tooth and stitch that tooth on. So now I've got both teeth on, and I can finish out with a couple more stitches. Back to front, front to back, back to front, front to back. Now at this point, I've finished my mouth, and my needle should be, or my thread should be on the back. So this is what it looks like. And I'm going to show you how to tie a knot here in a really easy way. So what I'm going to do with my needle still threaded is I'm going to slip it under the very last stitch. I'm just going to put my needle in there. And I'm going to pull this through, but I'm not going to pull it all the way through. I'm going to leave a teeny tiny loop right there. So I'm not quite pulling it tight. And before I pull it tight, I'm going to put my needle through that loop. Oops. And then I'm going to pull it tight, and you can see that it ties a knot there. And once I've tied a knot there, I can cut the rest of the thread off. I'll show you one more time in case you didn't get it. Slip it under your last stitch and pull until there's just a barely tiny small loop left. So not quite pulling it full. And then I put my needle through the loop here, and then I pull it tight all the way. Then I can cut this off. And now I'm ready to move on. So I just stitched my mouth, and I have a little bit of thread left, but I'm going to go ahead and take that out and start with a fresh, longer piece for the next part. I'm going to use the same felt I used for the face to cut out 2 horns for my Yeti's head. And a little trick to making them symmetrical or exactly the same is to fold your felt in the spot where you're cutting the horn. And you can cut the horns into whatever shape you like. But if I fold it first and cut both sides of the felt, I can make 2 matching horns. So I want to actually place the horns exactly where I want them to go. And then I'm going to flip them down, but keep the straight side of the horn and exactly the edge of the thread. We are going to start stitching the body pieces together, but we're going to stitch the horns in at the same time, and we're stitching it inside out, and we'll flip it later. But so I'm making sort of a sandwich with my the face of my Yeti, and then the horns which are flipped inward, and then I'm going to put the back piece right on top, matching up all the edges. And so if I hold it like this, you can see the edges of my horns are touching right there on the edge of the Yeti. So this is how I'm going to start stitching the head together. And I'm going to get myself another arm's length of yarn. I want to make sure it's as long as my arm from shoulder to fingers so that I don't run out before I finish the step. And I'm going to thread my needle by pushing the end of the embroidery floss through. Pull it 3 or 4 inches so you have enough of a tail that it doesn't fall out, but not so much that it's all the way down. And then the long side of your thread, we're going to loop and tie a knot on the end. Just 1 knot. Just like I would start if I was tying my shoes, I just loop it around and pull. All right, so for this step, we're going to do something called a loop stitch. And I'm going to start on one side of the head, and I'm going to stitch all the way around to the other side of the head. I don't want to stitch the sides yet because we're going to add arms there, just like we added the horns. So I'm going to start over here, kind of on the right side of the head, and I'm going to go back to front on every single stitch and then loop it around. So I want to stay close to the edge of the felt, but I want to make sure each time I am getting my needle through both pieces of felt. So I'm going to pull back to front, pull until my knot catches, and then I'm going to loop my needle around and go back to front again. Pull it tight, back to front, pull it tight, back to front, pull it tight. Now this spot here is where I'm about to start getting the horns in there. So I want to make sure my needle goes through all 3 pieces of felt here. Back to front, pull it tight. Back to front, pull it tight. Back to front, pull it tight. And I'm going to continue this loop stitch. And if you look closely, you can see my stitches are pretty close together and they're very close to the edges. So I want to continue that. And I'm going to adjust and make sure that everything's matching up here. Before I stitch this side, I'll make sure everything's in the right spot. I'm going to go ahead and continue stitching around the head, back to front. Each stitch is the same. Now I'm starting to approach where that other horn is. So before I get there, I'm going to stop and make sure it's right on the edge, right in its spot. And now I want to ensure that I'm going through all 3 pieces of felt for this section. Back to front through all 3. If I don't get that horn on the edge, I might miss it completely. And then I'm going to put a few more stitches in after the horn. I don't want to go all the way down the side of my felt here. And then I'm going to tie this off the same way I tied off the mouth. I'm going to slip my needle here, slip my needle through the very last stitch that I put on there. And I'm going to pull, but I'm going to leave a really small loop at the end. And I'm going to put my needle, my yarn got twisted a little here. So I'm going to pull it until there's a small loop and then put my needle through the loop and then pull it tight. And that makes a knot. I'll show you one more time. Go through the last stitch, pull until there's just a little bit of a loop left, and then put your needle through the loop and then pull it tight. And then you can cut that off. And if you were to open this, you can kind of see when we eventually flip it out how the horns are going to stick up. Now they're stitched in there. But I'm going to keep it inside out for now until we finish stitching.